Hi there. Um, any of you have noticed that my message I left a while back saying that it might be some time before I did another video? Well, I've finally gotten around to it. Just last week, I did a talk on a Zoom meeting, of course, for my local camera club. And the title was Gear Doesn't Matter Until It Does. And basically, I want to kind of paraphrase that here in this video, because all too often we get caught up in gear. Look at a lot of the photography channels on YouTube, and except for a few, you'll find that the majority of them deal primarily in gear, because gear gets views. Okay? Gear gets views. People will want to see what the latest, greatest gear is. Because basically the real photographers, the ones that are out taking pictures, aren't probably sitting around watching YouTube videos that much. But the ones that want to drool over gear are there all the time because they want to see what's the latest and greatest. Yes, I am guilty of that. But let me put all of this in some sort of perspective. Okay? Nowadays, a lot of people think that they need to upgrade to a new mirrorless system if they have a DSLR. Is that a requirement? Not at all. If the camera you are using now is adequate, if it does everything you ask of it without causing any great pain and suffering, and if you get images that you are pleased with, then you don't need to upgrade, or update, I should say, because in many cases it's not even an upgrade. So, if you don't need to update, then why update? Well, we do want things, and if we can afford them, why not? So, let's take a look at what actual requirements there are. What point did I want to make? Most of us, as amateur photographers, notice I'm not including professionals in this. As amateur photographers, our gear requirements are far simpler than most of us want to actually admit. Most of us can get by quite well with pretty much any reasonable entry-level model that has been made in the last 5 to 10 years with the kit lenses that came with it. Now notice I said lenses because the basic kit lens, which usually is a 3.5 to 5.6 aperture, it has a focal range similar to an 28 to 80 on full frame. That is your typical kit lens. But quite often these cameras are sold with a second lens. That second lens is probably an f4 to 5.6 or 4.5 to 6.3. It's usually an 80 to 300 millimeter range, and that's the second lens that comes in a lot of these two lens kits. So let's assume that that's where you start. Okay, so what do you want to do? You want to be the family archivist, probably the most important role for most amateur photographers. Guys, let's face it, decent pictures of your family are things that will have lasting impression on people for a long time to come. These pictures, if they are printed in an album or if they have been archived somewhere where people can access them, will be around giving enjoyment to people long after you probably aren't. So, that's an important role. But right now, this will do that job quite well. For the most part, you only need things in a very limited focal range. So that 28 to 80 equivalent zoom that came as a kit lens is pretty much all you need. You need some low light capability, but if you learn how to use a flash and you can bounce it, then it'll probably do the trick for you. And again, most of the phones now do very well in low light. So guys, although it's the most important job, it's the least gear specific. And I do really push the fact that it is truly an important job. I've seen such terrible pictures of other people's kids that are the same age as my kids, who are now, basically all in their 30s. Their childhood pictures are grainy, fuzzy, out of focus things shot with a disposable camera back in the disposable film camera days. Whereas mine were shot with an SLR and a decent lens and a decent flash. So I have some technically better pictures. I'm not going to talk about composition. Some of these images that are blurry and so on were still tremendously well composed. It's just that the person didn't have the gear to do the job right. Mainly portraits. What about the portrait person? What do they need? Well, other than, again, those kit lenses, the big thing a portrait person is going to need is at least one fast prime. And that fast prime has to fit in the range from a 35mm equivalent to an 85mm equivalent. Much longer than 85, and you are talking about having to have a great deal of distance from your subject. Any shorter than 35, and you are going to be so close to your subject that you are going to cause facial distortion that they are not going to like. So, generally speaking, most photographers tend to like the 50 to 85 range. Now, how fast? Well, typically f1.8 lenses are quite inexpensive in that range. There are some f1.7s. You can go with an f1.4, which will cost you significantly more. And of course, there are the f1.2s, but now we are getting into megabucks. And these are lenses that you have to use very carefully. Quite often I've seen people who have posted images from their wide open from their f1.2 85mm lens, and basically nothing that should have been in focus was in focus. Maybe the tip of the nose was in focus, maybe the ear was in focus, the eyes weren't, or one eye was in focus and the other one wasn't because of a slight tilt of the head. You can have depth of field that's too shallow. The ready for anything generalist, well, we've already spoken about the fact that if you have that 2-lens kit, you're ready for pretty much anything. Don't expect to be able to handle low light situations. Don't expect to be able to handle super fast action. But for the most part, everything else you can get some decent images. So it doesn't have any special requirements beyond that 2-lens kit. Wildlife, or dare I say it, bird photography. Okay, guys, get out your wallets. The thing is that you are going to need two things that are nice to have but aren't necessary in the earlier categories. Number one, you are going to need a camera with very fast autofocus. You are going to have to be able to focus on moving objects very, very quickly. Secondly, you are going to need a long lens that is sharp and fast enough to allow you to get higher shutter speeds. So now we're talking the 300mm range lenses with reasonably fast apertures of 5.6, 4, or dare I say it, 2.8. And now we're getting into lenses that could cost anything from a couple of $1,000s to $20,000. Expensive area. Some companies have some very good lenses that are less expensive than that, so shop around. Outdoor sports. That 2-lens kit again probably will do most outdoor sports if they're not too fast. And for the most part, a high school football game is not a tremendously fast-moving sport. Baseball or softball can be, if you're trying to capture a runner in action, it can be a little bit difficult. But for the most part, you can manage it with that 2-lens kit again. However, if you want to shoot something like hockey, you are now going to need a fast lens. Something of at least f2.8, because indoor hockey arenas or indoor basketball, we are now talking about having to push your ISO and having to have a fast enough lens to be able to handle much lower light than you get outdoors. Let me see, what else do I have? I'm checking with my notes here now. What have I missed? Travel photography. Well, if you have one of those super zooms, I went to Mexico, the first real trip I'd taken in a long time, quite a few years ago now. But what I took with me was my Olympus EP2, not exactly a fast camera, with the EPL1. I took a 17 millimeter f2.8 lens. That's a 34 millimeter equivalent. That was my street lens. And a 40 to 150 f4 to 5.6. That's the 80 to 300 equivalent I mentioned. That is all I took. Basically, I left one lens on one camera, one on the other. And I came back with some excellent pictures because I wasn't fussing with gear. And that's the thing about travel photography, guys. If you don't have to fuss with gear, it's going to be a lot more fun. The other thing about travel photography is get out there and look for something that shows the local color, shows some of the local culture. Don't just go looking for all of the tourist sites that everybody already has 50,000 pictures of. Okay? You know, if you're walking down a street in Paris and seeing all of these nice little sidewalk cafes, you can probably get some much nicer pictures there than running over to try and get another picture of the Eiffel Tower, which everybody has already shot many, many, many times. So that's about it. So freedom is the big thing. And street photography I can lump into this category as well. Keep it simple. The smaller and less conspicuous your camera is, the less likely it will be stolen, and the more likely that you will get a chance to get some good images without drawing too much attention to yourself. Okay. So, macro photography. Aha, can't leave that out. The macro photographer, of course, is going to need a macro lens. Although some zooms can zoom in very, very close, especially something like an 80 to 300 with a supposedly macro mode, it's not going to give you a one-to-one magnification, but it will allow you to get very close and get some nice images. So you can start out with something like that. But pretty soon you are going to want a dedicated macro lens. And that dedicated macro lens will allow you then to get that one-to-one. The longer the focal length of the macro lens, the better, because it gives you working distance. I have a 30 millimeter macro lens. I have to practically be on top of something in order to get a picture of it. So the lens is pretty much useless if I want to take pictures of bugs. For bugs, I need a longer focal length. If I had a 90 millimeter, it would be great. I would be far enough away that I wouldn't spook the bug and I could get a good picture. Landscape photography. Believe it or not, again, this does not have many things in the way of special requirements. Many people think that you need a super wide lens to do landscapes, and they go out and they shoot their landscapes, and then they look at it afterwards and say, but I don't see anything. It's just kind of a big horizon. And, you know, it's a lens that needs care. So the old 28 to 80 equivalent, play around with the focal lengths there. You got everything from a reasonably wide lens to a reasonably telephoto lens, all in one package. Since you're going to want maximum depth of field, you are going to stop it down to 5.6 or 8. And the result is that you're going to get decent images with just that. So it's not something that requires much. The big important thing with landscape photography, make sure you have a good tripod. And if you want to get long exposures, you may want a neutral density filter in order to be able to allow you to get slower and slower shutter speed in bright light. I think a good alarm clock and good shoes is more important for a landscape photographer, because quite often you are going to want to get out real early in the morning to capture that morning light, which puts such a nice glow on so many things. All right, that covers all the categories that I have here except art photographer. And art photographers, let's face it, guys, art photography is an area where you are probably working mainly in abstracts. The result is that absolute sharpness and things like that are not going to be important to you. Instead, you're just going to want total control so that you can control the shutter speed and the aperture to get the effects you want. So again, our basic kit will do the trick. But art photographers tend to play around with, you know, adapted lenses and things like that in order to get effects that are different. Finally, megapixels. 40 plus megapixel cameras are becoming quite common. I mean, nowadays 36 megapixels is sort of a starting point for these high megapixel cameras. But the issue with that is this: once you get up into that range, you now have collateral financial damage. You are probably going to need a new computer. You are probably going to need a lot more storage space, whether it's SSDs or hard drives or whatever. And the result is that it may take some of the fun out of the hobby, because you now have spent a lot of money just to be able to process your images. That's why I don't... I'm not saying that I don't want a higher resolution camera, but 24 megapixels right now is quite fine for me. My cameras, most of them are 16 megapixels, and one of them is 24. That's it. It's good enough for what I'm going to do. I rarely print bigger than 8x10, therefore I don't really need it. The landscape photographer might like a high resolution camera, because if you're shooting landscapes, there's a good chance that you're going to want to print very large prints, because they make good wall hangings. They make good wall art. So that's one area where that might be good. A wildlife photographer might want it for its ability to crop. You can chop away an awful lot of a 50 megapixel image and still end up with a perfectly usable image. But for most of us, most of our images nowadays live online, where basically anything over 12 megapixels, well, seriously, anything over 8 megapixels is a waste. So we're not really all that hung up on total number of pixels. I have some excellent 20 by 30 canvas prints that were made with cameras that were, well, one was a 16 megapixel camera, but the image was cropped significantly before it was printed. And the other one was from a 6 megapixel camera. Now, if you stand really, really close, you can notice that there is a slight lack of sharpness, but printing on canvas is very forgiving. You end up with something that has a very nice artistic glow to it, you might say. Anyhow, guys, I've talked enough. Way too much, actually. The only point that you need as a takeaway from this particular is that, yes, I'm back, but seriously consider your needs. Don't put yourself in any financial distress because you buy something that you think you need. Okay, for the most part, if you have, like I said, gear that is doing what it needs to do right now, then don't update unless you have buckets of cash to take care of it and you have a real, honest-to-God need for features that are missing now. Well, guys, I guess I've spoken too much. I hope you're all doing well. Take care. This pandemic seems to be starting to be on the decline, so hopefully things will be back to normal soon. And in the meantime, as I said, take care, get out, take some pictures, don't go fussing over gear, and bye for now.